don't. They said there's a concept within the African American community that money whitens. That money whitens. And you spoke, Marc, about the fact that people come into the criminal justice system, and even if you give them the same fine, they don't have the same capacity to pay that fine. That you bring them in and you assume that they understand their rights, but they don't speak the language. You make these assumptions. So everyone says, oh, but they're all being treated the same, but they don't come to the table the same. And that's why I go back to that story of O.J. Simpson. Because again, what did OJ have that 98.999% of the folks that are going into the criminal justice system don't have? He had access to the best attorneys and the most money and do whatever it happens. And as a result, you see that money actually buys you the kind of justice you need. And what do these people have? But they don't have access to that kind of justice. So as you're writing about this sort of this system, one of the things I think that's really important for the criminal justice system is to restore the social contract. That if you want fewer people within the system, then what you have to figure out is, as you point out, people come in different ways. Well, they come in if they tend to have less education, if they're hungry, if they can't have access to work, if they can't find a place to live. All those things are feeder systems into the criminal justice system. And Khalil, you'll love this. Many, many years ago, I'm an old lady, but I'm at a Council of State Governments meeting somewhere in the Midwest. And one of the people at the table was like the majority leader of Indiana or Illinois. I couldn't remember. Anyway, so we're talking about criminal justice. And you know what he told us? This is like probably 1989. He said, you know how we plan prison beds in our state? Listen to this answer. He said, we plan prison beds in our state by going into the second grade class and counting the number of children at risk. That is the most frightening thing I have ever heard in my life. All right. They're 7. They're 7 years old in second grade. And yet they are looking at the consequences of that failed social contract that they were not invested in. And they knew that lack of investment at age 7 was going to mean that they were going to have to plan for what they were going to do with, their criminal justice system and their state penitentiaries and whatever. So it's not like it's a shock or a dirty little secret. I guess the question I have for maybe you, Marc, is if we've known for so long, or you look at the Perry Preschool Project about investment in early childhood education, why do we tolerate this?
I have to brag on Texas as part of the 2007. This is way back when Texas did the justice reinvestment instead of building more prisons. The Nurse Family Partnership was actually part, and it was proposed by a conservative Republican, a good friend of mine, Jerry Madden. And I was worried, frankly, that it would other right of center folks would say, gosh, we really should be. But he brought the evidence that shows if you invest in that, even right after childbirth, long term, that child is less likely to be in prison. And I think, I will tell you, both the left and the right, I think, have something to contribute here, because you kind of made the point, of course, access to resources and care, whether it's prenatal care or care, later on, that and a lot of young single moms in particular, they don't have, nobody told them, nobody explained to them what it would take, and so, it's a learning process, and one where you need other supports to help you. And I think, those on the right have tended to emphasize with some validity, of course, that if it's a single parent household or there's exposure to violence, whether that's, gang violence in the park or family violence, those have really horrific consequences on children's development as well. So I think that we have to kind of do both of the above. It's both a resources issue and an issue of, basically equipping parents and also offering more through the school. That's the one place we know kids are going to be. So it's after school programs and actually locating kids. A lot of kids during COVID have gone missing from school and getting them back into school.
Right. There's an amazing statistic, Khalil, in your piece. From 2009 to 2019, the U.S. incarceration rate for Blacks fell by 29%. Let me just read that statistic again, because you'll see why. That from 2009 to 2019, the U.S. incarceration rate for Blacks fell by 29%, compared to a dip of 12% for whites. So I got to ask the question. So why do you think we're seeing that disparity? Now, if I said that in certain places that are like opposed to critical race theory or whatever, they say, aha, see, Look at that. They got a greater benefit than we did. So would you do me a favor, Khalil? No. Come on, Mark. We've been around the block. So Khalil, I want you to help me explain why that is the case. Because I think I sort of explained it a little bit before in our early part of our conversation. But how do I explain that so that whites will not feel like, oh my God, the crushing burden of being white. Look what's happening. We're feeling for the African American. We're not recognizing the burdens on whites. How do I talk about that statistic in a way that makes people understand that this truly is a good news story for both whites and blacks?
When we talk about the criminal justice system, I mean, even now to some of the listeners, our context, right, is that we are talking about a system that is producing outcomes that are not healthy to society at large. And that's racial disparities, a ton of other outcomes that we can point to. The dip in any level of incarceration, but particularly something as drastic as 29%, the reason why that benefits every single person is because what that means is we are simultaneously locking less people up. There are people who are currently incarcerated or who were incarcerated during that period of time who are being granted some form of release, whether it's timely release, early release, maybe they made a parole board after a couple of appearances, so on and so forth. What that ultimately means is less burden on a system, in this particular case, the criminal justice system, but particularly prisons and to some extent jails. We are talking about a system that is requiring less resources. And ideally, those resources are being placed in other much needed social networks, or social safety nets. And you mentioned one, which is early childhood education. Unfortunately, what we're not seeing is the much needed reallocation of some of those resources. And so, yes, we do know that investments in early childhood education is one of many ways that you can not only reduce exposure to the criminal justice system, but also exposure to incarceration, exposure to things like substance abuse and so on and so forth. But we're also looking at a lack of investment into communities, which again, right, investment into individual is one thing, but we also know, from the Million Blocks study, right, that there are certain communities who have been divested, and in some cases intentionally, for decades. And that divestment has led to a stranglehold on that community for access to resources, economic and social mobility, high school graduate level, so on and so forth. And so I would in summary say that less people in jails and prisons has no impact on how overall public safety is determined. Meaning that if we are purposely finding ways to give people what they need, and Marc made reference to this when he talked about equity as opposed to equality, if we gave people access to what they needed before they reach the criminal justice system, it would divert more people away. But more importantly, people who are caught up in the criminal justice system, instead of saying you have a substance abuse problem, or you stole this thing from this store, so therefore the right punishment is jail, we just need to figure out how much jail is appropriate, as opposed to saying, well, what is the reason that you stole that item? Is it because you're not employed gainfully? Is it because you have children at home that you need to feed? Is it because there's some lacking need in your life? And giving them what they need to address that, I think, is the ultimate benefit to having less people in the prison and jail system, whether they're diverted or whether they're pushed out of there after serving some sentence.
So Marc, as soon as I talk about race and criminal justice, the first words that come out of my friends on the other side, of which there are fewer, unfortunately, every day, is the idea of defunding the police. And they see that somehow the answer that we on the left are assuming is that the police are the problem. And therefore, if you defund the police, you resolve the problem. And I think this conversation is about the fact that we haven't even brought up cops. I mean, look at all the things that we have brought up. And it hasn't even been about arrests or police. It's been about sort of the feeder system, or what we haven't done so people aren't in the system. So I guess as we approach this, how do we approach police reform? And I guess one of the things that bothers me more than anything else is that they used to be referred to, and maybe we need to refer to them again, as officers of the peace. Because if you refer to them as officers of the peace, you have immediately embraced a different headset. And that headset is crucial in communities where that's what they want. They want peace. They want stability. I mean, peace doesn't happen when, there are guns going off everywhere. Peace doesn't happen when, you have to rob someone to pay a bill. That's not peace. And I'm just trying to figure out, how do we talk about police and criminal justice reform so that people can have a conversation without sort of, not tolerating each other, but finding a way for some common ground? Because I don't think this conversation is mutually exclusive from police reform.
Yes, and at this point, no jurisdiction has really defunded the police. One or two that may have initially reduced returned, and the issue is actually finding enough qualified people to take the jobs. So that's why there's shortages in some jurisdictions. But the real question is restoring trust between communities and police, so people report crimes, so victims come forward. And so that does require, as you said, a different kind of policing. It's not an issue really of how many officers, as much as it is what they're going to be doing. And of course, really focusing on building those relationships in the community, obviously on violent crime, not on something like stop and frisk, which produces the kinds of disparities we've been talking about, and then, as you said, upstream prevention. So if obviously someone doesn't get assaulted or someone doesn't get robbed, then there never is that call to the police. So I think most police figures we work with, we had a whole task force on policing that produced numerous recommendations that people can find on council on cj.org, but they want more tools in the toolbox. So not just police, but mental health interventions, for example.
Critical race query. If America is irredeemable, why are racial disparities in the criminal justice system plummeting? We got the numbers in this article. Marc Levin and Khalil Cumberbatch wrote the piece at the Washington Monthly. You will find it on my Facebook page, or you can go to the Washington Monthly and grab it. Grab it. Share the numbers with people. I think they would be shocked, but they need to know, because as we approach this conversation going forward, we need to be armed with facts. And that's what both of you have done. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Arnie.
Thank you.
This is the Tuesday edition of The Attitude with Arnie, Arnesen, and producers Dave Scott and Stephanie Collins. We will schmooze tomorrow, everyone. Ciao.
You better think about what you're trying to do to me. Think, let your mind go, let yourself be free. Let's go way on, way back when. I didn't even know you couldn't have been too much more than 10.